Welcome to Recovery Equity, a series of conversations about how we can reach and help more people find freedom from addiction. This is a space for us to reflect on some hard truths and to consider ways forward and even new possibilities. I am Dr. Princess Drake, a mental health practitioner at Hazelden Betty Ford. Today, we are talking about moving from cultural competence to cultural humility with Dr. Rashida Fisher, the program chair for counseling specializations at the Adler Graduate School. Welcome, Dr. Fisher. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. Before we get started, could you share with us where you get your passion for cultural humility?
This has been a passion of mine for a long time, and it comes from being a person of color and having personal experiences, seeing the experiences of friends and family, of colleagues, and I just happened to have my first professional work in an organization that had a huge passion for cultural competence and providing culturally responsive, culturally centered work. And so it's just been a natural progression throughout my life.
That is awesome. And you can see the passion just radiating from just even you talking about it and in your experiences. What would you say are the best working definitions for cultural competence and cultural humility?
Yeah, so there's lots of definitions out there, but and I will try to distill them down to a couple things. Cultural competence encompasses a set of knowledge, skills, and awareness that a person has in working cross-culturally. And so it emphasizes being able to understand the cultural practices, appreciating difference across culture, and developing skills to communicate and interact with someone that has a different cultural background than oneself.
And I would say for many of us, whether clinicians or not, we think we know, but how would you even define culture?
Yeah, with culture, that I think is the most important foundation for understanding cultural competence and cultural humility. Culture is a set of beliefs, values, actions, protocol, artifacts for living a life and understanding your place in the world. It gives people a set of grounding foundation for understanding themselves and understanding the people that they identify with. So it kind of unites and binds people as a people group when there's shared culture. And oftentimes we interchange culture with race and or with ethnicity or with various other kinds of identity. But culture is really more specific and much more generic than that or expansive than that. And it's also important to understand that there are, the two types of culture. There's the objective culture that is tangible, that many individuals began to learn and appreciate when they're moving into cultural competence. We understand objective culture as the artifacts and the institutions, the food, the fashion, the holidays, the literature, the dance, the language as far as English, Spanish, language that someone may speak. But understanding that only gets us so far in learning how to interact with individuals cross culturally. We begin to appreciate difference with those things and say, well, this people group eats this kind of food, and my people group eats these kind of food, etc. But then we should move into the subjective culture, and this is where it's much more nuanced. It is deep. It is about communication styles and rules, facial expressions, gestures, the importance of eye contact, the importance of personal distance, and things like that, tone of voice, oftentimes how we communicate courtesy and what friendships look like, what relationships look like, what family structures look like, attitudes around the elderly, attitudes and values around death and dying and money and all of those kinds of things, religion and faith. So again, it's really important to appreciate and understand that there is objective culture that is tangible, and that subjective culture that is much more intangible, but makes the most important difference in being able to understand um, those power dynamics, understand what is socially acceptable in our society and what types of that deep culture is deemed inappropriate, and that may cause rifts or ripples in a relationship cross culturally.
And kind of speaking to that notion of privilege and cultural competency and all those other things, oftentimes I'll hear people say, I don't have a culture or I don't have a specific thing that I identify with. I'm just human. What would you say to those individuals?
Well, I would say yes, we're all human, and that is absolutely correct. And we know that some of the people groups, the social structures and hierarchy we have in place is man-made. They are social structures that were developed for the purpose of granting power and privilege to certain groups and marginalization and oppression of others. And so that's where we get into, that's how we're moving from cultural competence to cultural humility. That is the appreciation, and that interpersonal stance of understanding not only your cultural identities, and we all have them, but also understanding when your cultural identities come with various levels of privilege and power in a society that are normalized, that are affirmed by societal structures, standards of living, etc. And when parts of your identity or parts of someone else's identity are not granted privilege, are marginalized, are discriminated against, are oppressed in that same society.
Thank you for making that distinction and kind of giving more clarity to that. What do you think, or why is it even important to make that distinction between cultural humility and cultural competency?
Yeah, because I think that it's important for understanding what you're doing when you, as you're working with people or in your family, in your community, whether you're a clinician or a community member. It's really important to know that we have structures, societal structures, norms, values that privilege some people and disadvantage others. And we are all impacted by that social structure. And so, by being a human being, by being a citizen in this society, we tend to perpetuate and reinforce those structures when we're not cognizant of the power dynamics that are at play in our interactions with people, that we can unintentionally engage in racist, sexist, homophobic, classist kinds of behaviors in our interactions, and it unintentionally um, communicate bias. We can unintentionally oppress individuals in our actions simply by following the rules that are set in society. And so, if we want to have a society that is equitable and just, and that promotes the health and wellness of everyone, then we just necessarily have to be conscientious about those power dynamics, and have that interpersonal stance, that commitment to understanding who you are and what your role is in perpetuating, um, and benefiting from the privileged status, but also in perpetuating marginalization and oppression of people by simply following the rules.
I like that, just not simply following the rules. And you think about so much of what we learn, even as a person of color myself. What would you say to someone who identifies again as a person of color who says, well, I don't need to be culturally competent? I've lived it.
Yes, and I would say that, being a person of color, there are areas of your life where you will experience marginalization from that. We know that white and in our society is more privileged than communities of color because of the hierarchy, social hierarchy of race. And yet, being culturally competent and then moving to cultural humility allows us to understand that that's only one part of who we are. And we have various other people groups and cultural groups that we are a part of. So then we look at economic status, we look at education status. So if you're a person of color that has had the opportunity of gaining education, formal education beyond high school, having a bachelor's degree, having a master's degree, holding a doctoral degree. Now you have moved into a cultural group that has advantage, particularly related to the ability to gain employment, have employment that allows you to live a manageable life. We look at ability status. Is there a physical or an invisible disability that you do not have that someone else may? So we're looking at all of the different kind of cultural groups that are in the United States and across the globe, really. Where do you experience privilege because of your position or your status in that people group? And where do you experience marginalization? There's an intersectionality of all of those identities that create a unique experience that is yours. We could look at gender identity, we could look at sex, we could look at lots of other categories, religious beliefs and practices, family structure, like all of those things where some family structures are more privileged than others.
And it sounds like all of those things are very much essential for creating equity. And what would you say are some of the practical ways a person can grow their level of cultural humility?
I would say again, it's a commitment. It's a lifelong commitment of knowing and understanding. So, starting with cultural competence, starting with understanding and appreciating difference, but then moving to understanding how difference impacts a person's well-being, the potential for them to maintain a quality of life. And you can do that through studying. There's lots of different um, there's books, there's documentaries, there are series like this that allow us to dig deep and to understand some of the nuances that we may not be familiar with. Having an open stance to this information, so being curious and non judgmental. I would say find a group of people, go outside of your normal day-to-day social structures to intentionally interact with people that are different than yourselves and begin to notice what those interactions look like and what dynamics are happening in those interactions. And then lots of self-reflection, lots of journaling, lots of time to fully appreciate who you are and where you fit in this society and what roles you can play to support equity and inclusion in our society.
Wow, thank you so much for all that really practical information. It's exciting to because people could get to know it themselves and really get to start to understand other people. On behalf of everyone watching or listening in, I want to thank you, Rashida, for giving us so much information to not only think about, but take into our own lives. And to everyone out there, please let your friends and colleagues know about these conversations and come back after and catch more episodes of Recovery Equity. Together, we can build a healthier, happier, and more equitable tomorrow.